Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Caldwell called her during rounds, his voice carrying the weight of every credential he'd earned and every corner office he'd climbed to reach. Hannah Clarke didn't flinch. She'd heard worse in languages he couldn't name, in places where the ground itself seemed to bleed. She simply adjusted the foredrip on bed 7 and moved to the next patient without acknowledging him, her movements economical and precise, the kind of economy that came from muscle memory forged in environments where wasted motion meant wasted seconds meant wasted lives. The Oak Creek Memorial ICU occupied the 5th floor of the Norfolk Hospital, a warren of beeping monitors and fluorescent lights that hummed like insects trapped in amber. 5:47 in the morning. Hannah had been there since 11 the previous night, which meant nearly 7 hours of silence broken only by the whispered conversations of other nurses and the mechanical breathing of patients whose bodies had decided to stop doing the work themselves. She moved between beds with a slight limp favoring her left leg, the residual gift of a blast pattern that had decorated her calf and thigh with scar tissue that climbed like ivy toward her hip. The limp was barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. Most people weren't watching for it. Most people didn't see her at all. On her neck, hidden beneath her scrubs and the collar of her undershirt, a single dog tag hung on a broken chain. She touched it without thinking whenever the alarms began to sound, her fingers finding the cool metal the way other people found rosaries or lucky coins. The tag wasn't hers. It belonged to someone who'd been her responsibility once, someone she'd failed to keep alive long enough for the Medevac Blackhawks to reach their position in Kandahar. That was 20 years ago. The tag had hung around her neck for every year since, a weight so familiar she'd forgotten it was there until someone asked about the chain. Which happened this morning at 5:53. "Hey Clarke, what's with the necklace?" Jennifer Park, a second-year resident, gestured toward Hannah's neck where the chain had slipped slightly above the scrub collar. "That looks old." Hannah straightened the collar without breaking stride, moving toward the medication station where a fresh set of 4 bags needed to be logged into the system. "Just something I keep," she said. Her voice was soft, almost deferential, the practiced tone of someone who'd learned decades ago that drawing attention brought complications. "My grandmother wore dog tags from World War II, Jennifer continued, apparently not sensing the conversation's expiration date. "Said it was bad luck to take them off." "Your grandmother was smart." Hannah didn't look back as she began entering data into the computer terminal, her fingers moving with the same precision she applied to everything. The keyboard clicked softly beneath her touch, each keystroke deliberate and measured. She'd been a nurse for 18 years. Before that, she'd been something else entirely, but that Hannah Clarke existed in a world of classified briefings and after-action reports that lived in filing cabinets with red stamps across their covers. At 6:15, Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrived for morning rounds. He was 58, tall enough to make other people feel small without trying, with the kind of jawline that could have been sculpted from marble by someone who understood that beauty and arrogance occupied the same space in certain men's faces. He wore a suit under his white coat, which no other physician at Oak Creek Memorial wore, which was the point. The suit cost more than Hannah's monthly salary. The watch on his wrist cost more than her annual salary. He was the chief of surgery, had been for the past 15 years, and his ascent through the hospital's ranks had been orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. People owed him favors. Other people's careers hung on his recommendations. His presence in the ICU changed the air pressure in the room, made it harder to breathe. He stopped at bed 3 where Hannah was documenting vitals from the previous shift, and he watched her work with the kind of calculation in his eyes that made animals nervous. "Vital signs on the Stevens patient," he said. Not a question. A command. Hannah turned from the computer screen. BP 120/78, holding steady. O2 sat 94% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Heart rate 68, regular rhythm. He's stabilizing. And your recommendation would be? She'd been about to suggest that they adjust the pain management protocol, that Stevens was showing the kinds of micro-expressions that indicated he was experiencing more discomfort than his current medications were managing, that a combination of fentanyl and low-dose propofol might give him better quality rest without dropping his respiratory drive. She'd been about to suggest this because she'd watched 734 patients move through this ICU over 18 years, and she'd learned to read the language their bodies spoke. But Dr. Caldwell was watching her, and she was just a nurse. "Nothing at this time, doctor," she said instead. "His current protocol seems appropriate." Something flickered across Caldwell's face, annoyance, perhaps, or the recognition that she wasn't going to give him anything useful. He smiled, thin as a blade. "Good. Stick to your scope, Clarke. Nursing is important, but it's not medicine. Let's keep the roles clear." He moved to the next bed without waiting for her acknowledgement. Hannah stood absolutely still for exactly 3 seconds, her hand finding the dog tag beneath her scrubs, her fingers closing around it with enough pressure to make the edges bite into her palm. The pain was information. Pain was data. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, a pattern she'd learned in a place where controlling your breathing meant controlling the panic that could get you killed, and then she returned to her charting as if nothing had happened. By 7:45, the shift had begun to transition from night to day. The ICU started its morning rhythms, fresh blood draws, medication rounds, the families of overnight patients beginning to arrive with coffee cups and worried expressions. Hannah had just finished checking the ventilator settings on bed 12 when the trauma alert came through the overhead intercom. The voice was clipped, professional, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd delivered this same announcement 1,000 times. "Trauma alert, all available personnel to Trauma Bay 1. Critical incoming. Marine Sergeant Major David Chen, age 43, GSW to left lower abdomen with possible visceral penetration. ETA for minutes." The trauma alert activated something in the ICU that was only visible if you knew how to look for it. The nurses moved differently. Their movements became purposeful in a way that suggested they understood the difference between busy and important, between occupied and focused. Hannah heard the alert come through, and she heard that name, and she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the dog tag. She stood exactly where she was while her hands continued their work as if they belonged to someone else entirely, as if they operated on their own muscle memory while her mind traveled backwards 20 years to a place where the smell of diesel and dust and burning plastic had become the smell of survival. David Chen. Sergeant Major David Chen. She knew that name. She knew that face, or she'd known it once, when it was younger and belonged to a private first class who'd been standing 12 feet away from an IED detonation in the Panjwai district of Kandahar province during Operation Enduring Freedom. She knew what she'd pulled out of the rubble, how his body had been folded at angles that bodies shouldn't fold, what color his blood had been when she'd fought to keep it inside his body using her hands and a combat knife, and the kind of desperation that lived in the space between mission and morning. That David Chen was supposed to be dead. That David Chen had been medevaced to Bagram 17 minutes after she'd found him beneath a collapsed wall, and she'd never heard what happened to him after that because you didn't follow up on ghosts. Ghosts stay dead in your memory, frozen in time, exactly where they'd fallen. But ghosts didn't arrive at trauma bays in Norfolk, Virginia, in the year 2024 with gunshot wounds and a second chance at survival. Hannah moved toward the elevators without being asked, her limp slightly more pronounced now in a way that might have been pain or might have been the weight of time collapsing into the span of a single afternoon. The elevator doors hissed open, and she stepped inside with Dr. Caldwell, who'd already begun to transform into the version of himself that appeared when critical patients arrived, sharper, faster, his arrogance hardening into something that might have been competence if you were willing to separate the two. He glanced at her, this nurse with the limp and the broken chain and the practiced invisibility. "You've done GSW work before?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "For letters?" "For years. 3 tours." A classification level that meant she couldn't tell him the address or the casualties or the specific nature of the wounds she'd treated in that distance between the moment of impact and the moment of medevac. The dog tag beneath her shirt seemed to weigh more than it should, seemed to be transmitting signals that only she could receive. The doors opened on the ground floor and they walked toward the trauma bays, where a flurry of activity had already begun. Trauma surgeons positioning themselves like chess pieces. Anesthesia setting up their equipment with the precise movements of people who'd done this hundreds of times. Nurses laying out trays of instruments with names most people would never learn. And in the center of all that purposeful chaos, David Chen. He looked like someone had tried to erase him. His left side was wrapped in makeshift field dressings that someone had applied with speed rather than precision, bandaging that suggested he'd been triaged quickly and transported faster. His face was ashen, the color of concrete in winter light. But his chest was still rising and falling, still fighting, still moving through the work of survival with a kind of determination that didn't appear in people who were ready to stop. Hannah moved to the monitors and began pulling up the baseline readings that would tell them everything the paramedics had recorded about his condition during transport. His blood pressure had been dropping steadily. His heart rate was elevated but holding. He was in shock but not yet in full decompensation. He was alive, and he'd arrived at the right hospital at the right time, which meant his survival was theoretically possible. It would require aggressive intervention. It would require someone to believe he was worth saving, even when the initial presentation suggested his injuries might be unsurvivable. Hannah studied the trauma imaging as it came through, CT scans showing the GSW trajectory, the damage pattern, the specific organs that were involved. Her mind performed calculations that she'd learned in environments where the difference between analytical precision and emotional response meant the difference between saving people and losing them. The round had entered at the left lower quadrant and had created a wound track that involved the small intestine, possibly the descending colon, possibly the spleen. Massive hemorrhage risk. Infection risk. Multiple surgical approaches would be necessary, sequential interventions, careful management of fluid resuscitation while preparing for the operating room. This patient would survive if, and only if, he received the kind of treatment that understood he was worth the risk. Dr. Caldwell was already speaking, his voice filling the trauma bay with the kind of authority that came from having other people defer to him automatically. He was assessing the injury, beginning to formulate his approach, and Hannah watched the calculation happen in real time across his face. She watched him recognize that this was a complex case. She watched him recognize that it was risky. She watched him recognize that if anything went wrong, if the patient died on his table or afterward from complications, there would be questions about whether an aggressive approach had been the right choice. She opened her mouth to suggest an intervention protocol. She thought about the kind of treatment approach that would give this sergeant major the highest probability of survival. Then she watched Dr. Caldwell's eyes narrow with something that looked like recognition, and she realized he was looking at the name on the intake form, and he was recognizing that this wasn't just any patient. This was someone important enough to be a sergeant major, which meant this was someone who had connections, someone who had support structures, someone whose family would ask questions if something went wrong. That was when she understood that Dr. Caldwell had already made a decision. Not about how to save him. About how to proceed with caution. The family consultation room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like industrial antiseptic and dread. Maria Chen sat rigid in the plastic chair, her hands folded so tight the knuckles had gone white. Her husband, Sergeant Major David Chen, unconscious in the ICU 2 floors above, had been airlifted in 6 hours ago with blast injuries that made Hannah's chest tighten the moment she saw the imaging. Penetrating thoracic trauma. Cardiac proximity concerns. The kind of wound that separated the living from the dead by millimeters and minutes. Dr. Caldwell entered with the confident stride of a man who'd never been questioned in his life. He wore a tie that probably cost more than Hannah's monthly car payment, and he moved through the room like he owned it. He sat across from Maria, his expression arranged into something that resembled sympathy but felt like theater. "Your husband is stable," Caldwell began, his voice smooth as oil. "We're monitoring his condition conservatively, giving his body time to respond to the initial trauma management." Hannah stood against the wall with the chart, watching Maria's eyes search for hope in those words and find none. The blast pattern on the CT showed cardiac proximity concerns. Conservative monitoring meant watching. Waiting. Hoping the injury sealed itself while the clock ran down. But, Hannah said quietly, the cardiac enzymes are trending up. His troponin levels suggest myocardial involvement. Caldwell didn't turn his head. Nurse Clarke seems emotionally invested in this case. He said it like she'd confessed to something shameful. I have to question whether she's professionally stable enough to maintain objectivity. This kind of attachment concerns me. The word hung in the air like smoke. Attachment. As if caring was a disease. Maria's eyes widened. Her hand came up to her mouth. What does that mean? It means, Caldwell continued, still ignoring Hannah directly, speaking through Maria as if Hannah were a ghost, that sometimes our nurses form connections that cloud their clinical judgment. We're trained to recognize these warning signs. Patient safety requires vigilance. Hannah took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned in Kandahar, where the air came thick and hot and tasted like copper. She felt the wet pressure building behind her eyes, not from fear, not from shame, but from the precision of his blade. He'd chosen his moment perfectly. In front of the patient's wife. In front of the documentation she couldn't later deny he'd said it. A single tear escaped. Just one. Hannah wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand steady, her jaw set at an angle that could have cut glass. Sergeant Major Chen deserves a doctor who fights as hard as he did, Hannah said. Her voice had dropped an octave. It came out quiet but weighted, the kind of quiet that filled rooms and pressed against eardrums. Caldwell's face reddened. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against tile with a sound like a weapon being drawn. You're dismissed from this consultation, Nurse Clarke. Return to your assigned duties. Hannah placed the chart on the table with deliberate care and left. Behind her, she heard Maria asking questions Caldwell wouldn't answer, her voice climbing toward panic. The break room smelled like old coffee and the ghost of someone's microwaved fish from lunch 3 days ago. Hannah sat with her tray, a sandwich she had no intention of eating, a bottle of water, a yogurt she'd grabbed without thinking. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn overhead. The email from Caldwell had circulated that morning. Subject line, concerning behavior patterns, FYI. Carefully worded, of course. Not an accusation but a question. Not a criticism but an observation about unusual focus on a specific patient case and the potential boundary concerns and need for professional peer support discussions. The kind of email that didn't explicitly say anything but made sure everyone understood exactly what was being implied. The door to the break room opened. Dr. Patricia Hayes entered first, grabbed her lunch from the refrigerator, and left without sitting. Then came Dr. Marcus Bennett. He looked at Hannah, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stood and walked out. Dr. James Sterling came in, saw her, and reversed course so quickly he nearly collided with Dr. Sarah Mitchell coming in behind him. One by one, 20 doctors rose. Not all at once. Spread across maybe 90 seconds. But coordinated. The last one out, Dr. Raymond Graves, who'd always been kind, who'd once brought her coffee when she stayed late, glanced back with an expression of apology before keeping walking. The door swung shut. The break room hummed with the sound of her own breathing. Hannah stared at her untouched coffee. The liquid had gone cold, a thin film forming on the surface like the coffee was dying in real time. She didn't move. Didn't leave. Didn't cry. She sat in the empty room and learned what isolation felt like when it wore the face of cowardice. The next morning, Caldwell had posted a write-up on the unit board. Official. Typed. Laminated. Dated and signed. It cited protocol violations regarding patient boundary maintenance, unusual focus on non-assigned cases, and the concerning patterns of behavior that may impact patient safety. He'd appended 3 bullet points, each one vague enough to resist challenge but sharp enough to wound. A resident team clustered around the board when Hannah arrived. One of them looked up, flushed, and scattered them away. But she'd heard it, Caldwell's voice from inside the supply closet, carrying through the open door like he'd meant for her to overhear, Nurse Bleeding Heart. That's what we're calling her. Can't separate personal history from professional duty. Hannah read the write-up. Twice. Her hand remained steady, though she felt the flush creeping up her neck, that hot pressure behind her eyes again. Not from shame. From rage, cold and precise as a scalpel. but she swallowed it down. Let it settle into her chest where it belonged. She found Caldwell in the hallway outside the Chen ICU. He was reviewing a chart, his expensive pen poised over a progress note. "Sergeant Major Chen deserves better than your cowardice, Doctor," Hannah said. She didn't shout. Didn't tremble. She spoke the words with the calm certainty of someone who'd already decided what they meant. The words landed like rounds hitting body armor. Caldwell's head came up. His mouth opened. But Hannah was already walking away, and whatever he'd planned to say died before it reached his lips. That afternoon, Caldwell made a phone call. Hannah didn't know it then, but she would learn it later, a call to board member Patricia Cunningham during lunch. His voice smooth, his tone concerned. He'd used the word liability twice. He'd mentioned potential undisclosed history once. He'd asked, very carefully, whether the hospital's background check process on existing staff might be worth reviewing, especially for employees with unusual access privileges or sensitive patient connections. The same evening, he emailed the OR director. Precautionary measures regarding Nurse Clarke's assignment to critical care cases pending internal review. No explanation. No detail. Just enough to make sure everyone understood something was wrong. By the next shift, Hannah's badge access to the ICU had been restricted. She was reassigned to General Medical Surgical, her name removed from Chen's care team. When she questioned the charge nurse, the answer came padded with bureaucratic apology, administration directive. "I don't make these calls, Hannah. I'm sorry." She stood in the hallway outside Chen's room, visible but blocked, like she was looking through glass at something she couldn't reach. His wife Maria found her there, desperate, her eyes red from crying. "They're saying he's stable," Maria whispered, "but I can see he's not. Please. You know what he needs. Please." But that wasn't the worst part. Caldwell's hands moved across the surgical schedule like a conductor rearranging an orchestra. His office door was closed, the afternoon light casting sharp shadows across his mahogany desk as he typed, deleted, rearranged. Surgical Team A, originally assigned to evening coverage, shifted to day procedures across the hospital at St. Sebastian's, 30 miles away. Team B's on-call rotation extended another 4 hours past shift change. The attending surgeon who usually floated between critical care units was suddenly needed in the outpatient clinic for pre-op consults. Each change was small, innocuous, defensible. Together they created a void. Hannah didn't see the schedule revision until 1847 hours. She was restocking the medication cart when the digital roster updated on the monitor behind the nurse's station. The evening team, the competent one, the one with 3 cardiothoracic residents and a vascular surgeon, was gone by 1900. Replaced by junior staff and interns. The shift change would run from 1845 to 1930 with a skeleton crew, 15 minutes of maximum vulnerability. Hannah's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the only weapon left when your opponent controlled everything else. The restriction came next. Caldwell had been meticulous about that too. An administrative memo circulated from the Chief of Surgery's office, new access protocols for critical care units. Staff with unresolved professional concerns would require badge verification at every entry point, logged and timed. The language was bureaucratic, sterile. The message was unmistakable. Hannah's badge dinged at the ICU entrance at 1902. Then dinged again. And again. Each entry created a record. Each record was documentation. Caldwell was building a wall of her own evidence against her, brick by brick. By 1905, the formal charges arrived. Not verbally, not through a conversation with human beings. Through the hospital email system, flagged as urgent, CC'd to 4 separate department heads and 2 members of administration. The subject line read, Professional Standards Investigation, Staff Member Number 8 for 7291. Hannah didn't need to read her employee number on the document. She already knew it was hers. The allegations were constructed with surgical precision. Practicing beyond scope of nursing practice. Making unilateral treatment recommendations without physician authorization. Engaging in medication administration protocols outside her license parameters. Interfering with physician decision-making in direct patient care. Each charge was technically defensible, theoretically possible, and completely disconnected from the fact that she'd been trying to save a man's life against a doctor who wanted him to die slowly and quietly. The memo stated that a formal investigative hearing would be scheduled pending the completion of a preliminary review. Suspension pending investigation was standard. The wording suggested it was already determined. Hannah read it once in the break room, standing alone, the fluorescent light above her head casting everything in white. She didn't sit down. She didn't reach for the table. She simply read the words, the email address where she was to submit her statement, the date they wanted her to appear, and the notification that she was barred from direct patient care until the investigation concluded. It wasn't a request. It was a demolition. She was reaching for her phone to call her union representative when the overhead system crackled. Code blue. Trauma Bay 4. Not critical care. Not ICU. The worst possible location. The place where the crash response would have to cross the entire hospital to reach him. Hannah moved before her brain caught up. The hospital corridors during shift change are a specific kind of chaos, staff moving between units, families heading to evening visitation, transport teams pushing empty beds. She went against the current, her limp barely visible now, decades of muscle memory overriding the physics of her damaged leg. Her badge had already been flagged. Her access was already restricted. She had maybe 90 seconds before security could track her movement to critical care. The intercom called it again. Code blue. Trauma Bay 4. Cardiac arrest. Her fingers already knew the answer before her mind processed it. Sergeant Major David Chen. The boy she'd pulled from rubble in Kandahar. The man Caldwell had decided wasn't worth aggressive treatment. The trauma bay doors burst open as she arrived. The crash cart was positioned, but the attending was on his way up from the cath lab. 15 minutes away. The residents in the room, 2 of them, barely older than interns, were doing compressions, but their rhythm was off, shallow, the kind of compressions that looked correct in training videos and accomplished nothing in real bodies. Chen's monitor showed ventricular tachycardia that was degrading into fibrillation. His blood pressure was 0. His pupils were already blown. Get a 12 lead running, Hannah said, moving to the monitor. Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave without her permission, the way it always did when the decision had already been made. One of the residents looked at her. You're restricted. Your compressions are 30% too shallow. You'll break his ribs before you get oxygen to his brain. Hannah was already checking the crash cart, her hands knowing the exact location of every piece of equipment before she reached for it. Continue compressions but change your hand position. Heel of your palm directly on his xiphoid process, not his sternum. Full depth. Push until you hear the ribs crack. That's the sound of doing it right. You can't be in here. But she already was. She was already moving the defibrillator pads, already setting them to 360 joules, already calling out the sequence. The second resident, the one with actual critical care experience, started moving like he'd been waiting for someone to give him permission. He was changing the compression depth, his face showing the physical effort of real cardiac massage on an adult male. Hannah held up her hand at the monitor. Analyzing. Waiting. The rhythm was degrading. The drugs needed to be pushed. The defibrillator was charging. Clear, Hannah said. Just one word. Not a question. Not a request. The residents froze. Hannah realized why. They were looking at the doorway. 20 doctors were standing there. Not moving. Not entering. Not helping. 20 of them, wearing white coats and expressions that ranged from confused to defiant, because every single one of them had received an email from Dr. Caldwell's office within the last 90 minutes. The subject line read, Liability Concerns, Code Blue Response Protocols. The message detailed professional responsibility, institutional liability, and the dangers of assisting with care outside standard protocols. It suggested that involvement in non-standard treatment procedures could result in formal complaints, professional reviews, and possible termination of privileges. It wasn't technically an order not to help. It was just an email. Just information. Just enough doubt, just enough fear, just enough suggestion that each of them understood what not helping actually meant. Hannah looked at them. She counted each face, each white coat, each doctor who'd been standing in this hospital yesterday and who'd watched her walk into the break room and then got up and left. 20 of them. 20 people with advanced degrees and years of training and the physical capability to save the life of the man in front of her. All of them choosing a memo over a man. She turned back to the monitor. Defibrillation, she called out. The residents moved. The charge delivered. Chen's body arced against the stretcher from the electrical current, a mechanical movement that looked nothing like life. She checked the rhythm. Still fibrillation. Still nothing. Still the steady decline of a heart that was giving up. Push 1 milligram epi 4, Hannah said. Her voice was moving faster now, the rhythms of the protocol taking over, the part of her brain that had been trained in field medicine in Kandahar suddenly very present in this Norfolk trauma bay. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Now. One of the residents moved. The other one didn't. He was still watching the doorway, watching the 20 doctors, understanding the mathematics of his career against the life of one patient. The equation Caldwell had set up was working perfectly. Every variable was designed to end the same way. I need help, Hannah said. Not to the residents. To the 20 doctors in the doorway. I need someone who's not afraid. Nothing. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that happens when 20 people collectively stop breathing at the same time. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the only sound that mattered. Chen's wife was screaming somewhere beyond the trauma bay. Save him. Please save him. The sound muffled by distance and glass and the weight of institutional policy. Hannah looked at the procedure tray. At the scalpel sitting there, sterile and waiting. At the open chest before her, the ribs ready to be spread, the pericardium ready to be opened. At the blood that was filling his chest cavity, compressing his heart, killing him in real time while 20 doctors stood in the doorway and chose their careers over his life. She looked at Chen's face. For one moment, just one, she saw the boy. 17 years old, pulled from burning concrete in Kandahar, his eyes meeting hers through the smoke, the weight of his unconscious body in her arms as she dragged him across the rubble. The same face, older now, the same eyes that had trusted her then. If I do this, I lose everything, she whispered. Then her hands moved. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. 7:32 p.m. Evening shift change, the skeleton crew moment when two nursing rotations overlapped in confusion, when attention scattered like light through a prism. Chen was stable at that moment, vitals holding, heart rhythm steady on the monitor, but stability in the ICU was a word Hannah had learned never to trust. She was in the medication room restocking supplies, her movements precise despite the reassignment restriction that had stripped her of Chen's direct care. 3 days now she'd been relegated to peripheral tasks, her access to critical care units limited to supply runs and documentation. Caldwell's work, methodical as always. The restriction didn't mention her by name, it just said non-primary personnel require supervisory approval for patient contact, but everyone knew who it meant. The code alarm fractured the evening quiet. 3 sharp bursts. Then the overhead speaker, code blue, ICU, bed 4. Code blue, ICU, bed 4. Bed 4. Chen's bed. Hannah's hands went still. A single syringe hovered between her fingers. The world compressed to that moment, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the distant sound of running feet, the monitor's frantic electronic screaming bleeding through the hospital's communication system. Her body knew what her mind hadn't processed yet. Her body was already moving. She dropped the syringe. The tray clattered. She was through the medication room door before the second code announcement finished its echo. The ICU corridor was chaos wrapped in purpose. The crash cart was already rolling, 2 nurses pushing, a respiratory therapist running alongside with the ventilator bag. Hannah's mind pulled the information from what she could see in Chen's room as she approached. His monitor showed ventricular tachycardia. The jagged, useless rhythm of a heart that had stopped pumping blood effectively. His blood pressure was somewhere south of 70. Dropping. She didn't think about the restriction. Didn't calculate the cost of what came next. Her legs carried her into the room with the speed of someone who'd run into burning buildings before. Muscle memory needed no permission. "What's his rhythm?" she called out. Dr. Patterson, the evening ICU resident, looked up from Chen's chest where she was beginning compressions. "VTAC. We've got no pulse, no perfusion. Starting compressions." The resident's hands were competent, but they moved with the careful precision of someone following a protocol. Hannah could see the problem immediately. Chen's post-operative chest incision was the issue, the one she'd created less than 24 hours ago with a scalpel meant for sutures, not survival. Something internal had shifted. Something was bleeding inside. "Stop compressions," Hannah said. Patterson's hands froze. "I'm sorry. His rhythm isn't primary cardiac. Look at his chest." Hannah was already moving to the bedside, pulling on fresh gloves with sharp, deliberate movements. Tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac. "Compressions aren't going to fix this. We need an emergency thoracotomy." "Major," Patterson started, the word slipping out like a secret, like something remembered. "I can call Dr. Caldwell." "No time. Get me a scalpel, a medium blade. Chest tray. I need hemostats, a sternal retractor if we have it, suture kit." Hannah's voice had dropped an octave. The voice of someone who'd given orders on a battlefield. "Move. Now." The nurses stared. One of them, Rodriguez, good nurse, steady hands, didn't pause. She was already moving toward the supply cabinet. That was when the doorway filled with bodies. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the entrance like a storm system forming. Behind him came doctors. Not just a few, easily 20 of them, their white coats creating a wall of institutional authority. Hannah recognized faces from the department. Cardiologists. Surgeons. Residents who'd eaten lunch with her. Every single face held the same expression, the look of people who'd received careful emails about liability concerns, about a nurse practicing beyond her scope, about the dangers of insubordination. "What are you doing?" Caldwell's voice could have frozen nitrogen. "Step away from that patient." Hannah didn't look at him. She held out her hand and Rodriguez slapped a scalpel into her palm. The weight was familiar. Surgical steel, balanced for precision. Not so different from the combat knife she'd used in Kandahar, when a 17-year-old Marine bleeding out in front of her didn't care about protocols. "His coding from cardiac tamponade," Hannah said, moving to Chen's chest. "His heart's drowning in blood. Standard ACLS won't save him." I said step away from that patient. Caldwell moved toward the bedside. "You are not authorized to perform surgical procedures. Anyone who assists her shares her liability. Is that clear? No one touches that cart. No one helps. That is a direct command." Hannah could feel the wall of resistance settle over the room like a physical thing. The nurses froze. Patterson backed away from the bed. The respiratory therapist held the ventilation bag but didn't move closer. 20 doctors. Standing in the doorway. Watching. Doing nothing. She could feel their eyes on her back like weight. Like judgment. Like the moment when a choice gets made and everyone present becomes complicit in the decision to let it happen. Hannah positioned the scalpel's blade at the fourth intercostal space, left anterior axillary line. She could feel Chen's ribs under her fingertips, could count them by touch. The muscle memory didn't require sight. It required only the absolute certainty that the alternative was death. She incised. The blade went through skin, through the fascia beneath it, into the pleural cavity. The cut was clean. Necessary. A door opening into a space where life or death would be decided in the next 60 seconds. Blood flowed immediately. Dark venous blood, the color of drowning. It meant the pericardium was full, meant the heart was being crushed by its own leaking fluids. "I need that sternal retractor now," Hannah said. Her hands were steady as a laser. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. She was speaking to whoever still believed that saving a life mattered more than protecting a career. Nobody moved. She used her hands instead. 2 fingers under the rib cage, spreading the incision wider, creating space where space didn't exist. The pain would be extraordinary when Chen woke up. If he woke up. Right now, pain was irrelevant information. The pericardium came into view, that small sac surrounding the heart, normally nearly invisible. But now it was distended, massive, full of blood that shouldn't be there. The cardiac laceration. The repair she'd made 23 hours ago hadn't held. Hannah reached in with a Kelly clamp. Her fingers found the bleeding point by touch, by memory, by the language that muscles learned in places where there was no time for hesitation. The laceration was small, maybe 2 centimeters on the right ventricle. A fault line that had opened when the heart shifted during the episode. Suture. 4-O-proline. Now, she said. Rodriguez made a movement toward the supply cart, but Caldwell's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Do not assist her. That is an order from the chief of surgery. Anyone who helps her faces immediate termination. Do you understand me?" The nurse stopped. Hannah didn't wait. She held pressure with one hand while her other hand reached for the suture kit. She was operating on a heartbeat that was barely there, a blood pressure she could feel dropping through Chen's artery, a window of maybe 90 seconds before cellular death became permanent. Her fingers found the needle. The suture thread was gossamer thin, the kind of precision work that required absolute concentration. She could hear the ventilator hissing. Could hear Caldwell's breathing, rapid and furious, from the doorway. Could feel the weight of 20 doctors watching a nurse commit career suicide to save a man's life. She sutured. 1 stitch. 2. Her hands moved like she was back in Kandahar, back in that burning compound, back in the moment when a 17-year-old kid's life depended on her steady fingers. The laceration closed. The bleeding stopped. She applied direct pressure for 5 seconds. Released. Waited. The heart rate on the monitor climbed. 80. 85. 90. The rhythm shifted from the chaotic spikes of ventricular tachycardia to something organized, something alive. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. A steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Hannah stepped back. Chen's chest rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm. The bleeding had stopped. The heart was pumping again, pushing blood through vessels, feeding tissue, keeping a man alive who should have been dead. The room was silent except for the ventilator's mechanical whisper and the monitor's steady beep. Hannah looked down at her hands. Chen's blood covered her gloves, her sleeves, had soaked through to her skin. She felt the weight of 20 doctors' stares. Felt Caldwell's rage radiating from the doorway like heat. "I'm going on break," she said quietly, peeling off her gloves. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. No one responded. She walked past the doorway. Past Caldwell, whose face had gone the color of old bruises. Past the ring of doctors who parted without moving, who avoided her eyes like she was carrying a contagion. Her badge was already gone from around her neck. She'd been expecting this moment, had already known it was coming the instant she made the choice to cut into Chen's chest. By 8:15 p.m., security was escorting her from the building. By 8:30 p.m., Caldwell had filed formal charges of practicing beyond her scope, reckless endangerment, violating direct orders, operating without surgical privilege. The paperwork was notarized and submitted to the state nursing board before her car had cleared the hospital parking lot. By midnight, the hospital attorney was preparing the termination notice. By sunrise, Hannah Clarke was suspended pending investigation. She didn't go home that night. She found herself driving in the rain, the kind of rain that came from nowhere and swallowed everything, and eventually the road led where these kinds of drives always lead, to a cemetery on the edge of Norfolk, where headstones stood in rows like an audience for grief that would never have an audience large enough. The marble was cold. James Clarke's name carved in granite, with dates that spanned 39 years and marked the exact length of the marriage she'd thought she'd spend the rest of her life remembering. She knelt in the rain. The dog tag was in her hand, the broken chain had been repaired with fishing line, held together by improvisation like so much else she'd tried to fix. "I couldn't save you," she whispered to the stone. "And now I can't save the boy I pulled from the fire." The rain kept falling. The cemetery offered no answer, only the sound of water streaming down marble while her entire career dissolved in anonymous boardrooms 8 miles away. The suspension letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on hospital letterhead and sealed inside an envelope that felt heavier than paper should weigh. Within 48 hours, Dr. Caldwell had made his phone calls to the hospital board, 6 of them, each one carefully worded, each one designed to frame Hannah's emergency intervention as reckless endangerment rather than life-saving action. The board voted unanimously to suspend her pending a full investigation into her decision to perform an unauthorized procedure that violated scope of practice protocols. The words on the letter blurred as she read them a second time, then a third. She didn't argue. She didn't call her union representative. She simply removed her badge, placed it on the unit desk, and walked toward the parking garage with the same measured pace she'd maintained through 2 combat tours and 8 years of surgical deployments. That night, the rain came down like artillery fire across Norfolk, and Hannah found herself standing at the edge of her husband's grave in Riverside Cemetery, the only visitor at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening when the groundskeeper had already locked the gates behind her. She wasn't supposed to be here. Visiting hours ended at dusk, but the cemetery keeper knew her by sight now, the quiet woman in scrubs who came every few months with flowers she never left behind. The marble headstone read James Patrick Clarke, 1978 to 2016, beloved husband, brother, friend, and beneath it, a date carved into stone that marked the moment her life fractured into before and after. He died of an infection contracted during a routine procedure at a private clinic in Thailand, a preventable death if the surgeon had caught the early sepsis, if anyone had been listening when James tried to tell them something was wrong. She'd been in Kandahar when the call came. She'd been holding another soldier's chest open, keeping him alive with her hands, and she couldn't leave. Couldn't be there. Couldn't save him from 8,000 miles away. Now, with the rain soaking through her jacket and turning her scrubs dark as bruises, she held the broken dog tag chain in her fist, James's dog tag, which she'd carried through every deployment, every rotation, every shift at Oak Creek Memorial. The chain had snapped years ago, the metal weakened by salt water and sweat and the weight of too many prayers, and she'd never had it repaired because the broken state felt honest somehow, felt like it matched the fracture in her chest. "I couldn't save you," she whispered to the marble, her voice steady despite the rain and the cold, "and now I can't save the boy I pulled from the fire." The cemetery offered no answer, only the sound of water streaming down stone and the distant hum of traffic from Route 13 beyond the gates. She stood there for 40 minutes, not moving, not crying, just breathing, the way she'd been trained to breathe when the world around you was collapsing, slow and measured and controlled, like the breathing itself was an act of defiance. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came in the form of a classified security clearance file that Dr. Caldwell had requested as part of his employment verification inquiry, a routine request that triggered something in the Pentagon's background check system, something dormant for 7 years, suddenly flagged and routed to human review. The file reached Oak Creek Memorial's administration office on a Thursday afternoon, marked urgent and restricted, and it sat on the desk of Hospital Administrator Patricia Liu for exactly 2 hours before she opened it. The pages trembled in her hands as she read them aloud in an emergency board meeting called for Friday morning, her voice cracking on the first citation, Silver Star for Extraordinary Heroism in Combat Operations, Kandahar Province, 2009. She paused, taking a breath, reading the next line with disbelief. Bronze Star with Valor for Leadership Under Fire, Helm and Province, 2011. Then the third, Purple Heart for Combat-Related Injury, Loga Province, 2013, Service-Connected Disability Rating 40%. The room had gone absolutely silent, the kind of silence that fills a space like water, pressing against eardrums, making it hard to breathe. Board members exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to shame to something that looked very close to terror. That's when the doors of the boardroom opened and Captain Michael Reyes walked in, still in his Navy dress uniform, still carrying the bearing of a SEAL team leader who'd flown in specifically to check on Sergeant Major Chen's recovery. He'd brought documentation with him, official records, commendations, letters of recommendation signed by commanding officers. He stood before the assembled board and named every decoration Hannah had earned, each word landing like ordnance. Major Hannah Clarke led combat medical operations in Kandahar that saved 47 lives. 47. She trained 17 corpsmen in field trauma response. She performed emergency procedures under fire that military surgeons said should have been impossible. Sergeant Major Chen, the Marine in your ICU, she pulled him from rubble during a firefight in 2003 when he was a 23-year-old Lance Corporal bleeding out in a collapsed building. She kept him alive for 6 hours until medevac arrived. Reyes looked directly at each board member, his voice like a tank engine idling in a concrete garage, low and powerful and utterly terrifying in its control. And when he arrived at your hospital critical, she kept him alive again while your chief of surgery actively prevented her from helping him. The investigation that followed happened at speeds that shouldn't have been possible in a hospital bureaucracy. The FBI inquiry that Caldwell had pushed for, certain that Hannah's military background would raise security concerns that would bury her career, pivoted instead toward him. Federal auditors pulled 6 months of his patient files. They found altered surgical schedules that didn't match the official records. They found emails marked liability concerns that corresponded exactly to moments when Hannah had tried to escalate Chen's care. They found the names of 20 doctors on a carefully cultivated distribution list who'd been encouraged to avoid the ICU, to keep their distance from the patient, to let protocols dictate care rather than clinical judgment. They found a pattern so deliberate, so documented, so perfectly preserved in digital trails and email servers that Caldwell's own competence, the thing he'd always relied on to navigate hospital politics, became the instrument of his destruction. A former resident came forward with documentation of Caldwell pressuring her to modify a discharge summary for an uninsured patient, a 67-year-old woman whose cardiac complications had been buried in the amended report. The state medical board opened a formal investigation. Caldwell's malpractice insurance carrier sent auditors who found 18 separate incidents of chart alterations, treatment delays that increased patient complications, surgical errors buried beneath layers of amended documentation. Colleagues who'd participated in the break room exodus, who'd stood and filed out when Hannah sat down, now claimed they'd been pressured, afraid of retaliation, coerced by their chief of surgery into abandoning a patient. The hospital attorney issued a statement. The board issued a statement. Caldwell's own board connections evaporated as liability concerns overrode loyalty. Within 72 hours, his attorney advised him to resign before the board voted to fire him for cause. He didn't resign. The board voted unanimously to terminate him anyway, suspending his privileges immediately pending the state medical board's full investigation. The state board took for months to complete their review. When their findings arrived, 18 counts of patient care violations, evidence tampering, abuse of professional authority, they were delivered not in person but in a certified letter that arrived at Caldwell's home address on a Thursday morning in late October. The letter informed him that his medical license was revoked permanently, effective immediately. Meanwhile, Hannah was reinstated. The hospital issued a formal written apology read aloud in the auditorium before assembled staff. Her suspension was reversed. Back pay was issued. The 20 doctors who'd stood in the doorway of Chen's room and refused to assist now faced their own reckoning, some with genuine shame on their faces, others with relief that the investigation had pivoted away from them. Hannah walked through Oak Creek Memorial's corridors in clean scrubs, the dog tag visible now outside her collar, no longer hidden beneath layers of fabric and anonymity. She stood in Sergeant Major Chen's doorway as he sat up in his hospital bed, the cardiac monitor beeping its steady rhythm behind him, his body already beginning the long process of healing because Hannah had kept him alive long enough to reach the surgeons who could finish what she'd started. His eyes found hers, and he slowly brought his hand to his forehead in a salute, the gesture automatic, the respect absolute. Hannah returned it, her composure intact, her quiet dignity finally recognized as the warrior steel it had always been. "At ease, Sergeant Major," she said softly. "You did good, Marine." He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since he'd arrived at Oak Creek, and his voice was steady, learned from the best, Major Clarke. Behind him, his wife Maria stood with tears streaming down her face, not the tears of grief or fear, but the tears of someone who'd watched the truth finally surface, who'd watched the person who saved her husband's life reclaim her identity, who'd watched institutional cowardice finally meet its reckoning. In the Norfolk Mall food court, Dr. Caldwell sat at a folding table with supplemental insurance brochures fanned out in front of him, his name tag reading Sales Associate in printed letters. Shoppers walked past without recognition. Some glanced at him. Most didn't. He was no longer a chief. No longer a surgeon. No longer anyone's authority. The transformation was complete, from architect of Hannah's destruction to a man trying to generate commissions on insurance policies most people didn't want. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone in power who didn't know your true value, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? What would you have done in Hannah's position?